the quiet mountain town, and the Sharp family. On the surface, Keddie, California, was the kind of place people might imagine when they wanted to escape the chaos of city life. Tucked away in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Plumas County, it wasn't a town in the traditional sense. It was more like a cluster of cabins and a small resort, surrounded by towering pine trees and cut off from the fast pace of the outside world. By 1981, Keddie had a rustic charm that drew in families looking for cheaper rent or a fresh start, but it also had an undercurrent of struggle. Poverty was high, jobs were scarce, and while neighbors lived close together, there were secrets buried in those woods. The cabins had once been part of a vacation retreat, a railroad town with roots in the Western Pacific Railroad line, but by the early 80s, they'd turned into low-income housing. Some residents found it cozy and peaceful, others saw it as the last stop before nowhere. And into this setting came Glenna Sue Sharp and her 5 children, trying to carve out a new life after escaping a troubled past. A mother starting over. Sue Sharp was 36 years old when she packed up her kids and left her old life behind. Originally from Springfield, Massachusetts, she'd grown up in a strict household, one where appearances mattered but happiness often didn't. She married a man named James Sharp while still young, and for a while it looked like she was headed for the traditional path, a housewife, raising children in the military lifestyle that came with her husband's service. But that marriage crumbled under the weight of abuse, dysfunction, and control. By 1979, Sue had had enough. She made a choice that many women in her situation feared to make. She walked away. With nothing but her kids and what little she could carry, she left James and the toxic marriage behind. They moved west, settling first in Connecticut and later in California, where she hoped to give her family a better shot. Sue had 5 children: John 15, Sheila 14, Tina 12, Rick 10, and Greg 5. They were her world. Money was always tight, but she did her best to keep the family together and make ends meet with odd jobs and welfare support. Those who knew her in Keddie described her as a quiet woman, strong but reserved, who didn't open up easily to others. She wasn't outgoing, but she was fiercely protective of her children. Life in Cabin 28. In 1980, Sue rented Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. It wasn't much, a modest wooden structure with worn floors and mismatched furniture, but it was home. The kids quickly adjusted to the small, tight-knit life of the cabins. John, her oldest, was a typical teenager, restless and testing boundaries. He was tall, with long brown hair and a rebellious streak that sometimes put him at odds with his mother, but he was also protective of his younger siblings. Sheila, just a year younger, was the responsible one, often helping Sue manage the household and look after the younger kids. She was thoughtful and serious, and though she carried the weight of responsibility early, she also had that teenage longing for something more exciting than the isolation of Keddie. Tina, 12 years old, was quieter. She was still a child but teetering on the edge of adolescence, shy and sensitive. Then there were the 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg, energetic and carefree, running in and out of the cabin with the other kids in the neighborhood. Cabin 28 sat near the center of the resort, close enough to other families that the kids had playmates, but far enough away that the forest seemed to press in at night. The cabins were spaced like little islands in a sea of pine, and when darkness fell, it was easy to forget there was a world beyond those woods. Neighbors and shadows. The Keddie community wasn't glamorous. Many families lived paycheck to paycheck, scraping by in an area that had little opportunity for work. Some moved there because it was cheap, others because they wanted to disappear from bigger problems elsewhere. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other's business. But at the same time, people also minded their own when it came to secrets. Among the neighbors were the Smartt family, who lived just a short walk from Cabin 28. Martin Smartt was a local with a temper and a reputation for being unstable, while his wife Marilyn was friendly with Sue. The 2 women grew close, confiding in each other as they both struggled with difficult marriages. Around Marty often was his friend, John Boubede, a drifter with a shady past who had recently come to live in Keddie. This web of neighbors, friends, and drifters would later become central to the mystery of what happened in Cabin 28. But in early April 1981, it was just life in Keddie, messy, complicated, and mostly unnoticed by the outside world. The night before. On April 11, 1981, life in Cabin 28 unfolded like any other Saturday. The Sharp kids spent the day hanging around town. John had been with his friend Dana Wingate, a 17-year-old with a rough background of his own. Dana often stayed over at the Sharps' cabin, as his home life was troubled. Together, John and Dana had that teenage energy of boys who thought they were invincible, walking the railroad tracks and drifting between friends' houses. That evening, Sheila had arranged to stay overnight with her friend down the road, leaving Sue at home with her other children. Tina was supposed to join Sheila, but decided to come back home at the last minute, a decision that would prove tragic. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was ordinary, kids settling down for the night, Sue likely keeping herself busy while the younger ones wound down. By later evening, John and Dana made their way back to Cabin 28 to spend the night. The house was crowded, but that was normal. With teenagers, friends, and younger siblings, the Sharp cabin was often buzzing with people. What no one in Keddie knew was that this night would be different. This night, Cabin 28 would become the scene of one of California's most brutal and haunting unsolved murders. A town on edge. The early 80s were already a nervous time for small towns across America. Violent crime was rising in bigger cities, and though places like Keddie felt insulated, there was always a lingering fear of what could happen when the wrong kind of stranger drifted into town. Still, no one in Keddie expected what was coming. Some neighbors reported hearing odd noises that night, muffled thuds, a dog barking, perhaps even voices raised in anger. But in a place where cabins were thin-walled and people kept their heads down, it wasn't unusual to ignore what you heard. The woods were alive with sounds at night, and most residents were used to tuning them out. The Sharp family, living their quiet life in Cabin 28, had no idea they were about to become the center of a nightmare that would leave scars on the community for decades. And as the clock moved past midnight into the early hours of April 12, 1981, the darkness outside the cabin walls seemed to close in. The night of terror. The night of April 11, 1981, seemed ordinary enough in the small, scattered cabins of Keddie. Spring nights in the Sierra Nevada were still cool, and as the sun set behind the mountains, the dense forest around the resort grew darker and quieter. By 9 p.m., the cabins were lit with the soft glow of lamps, televisions buzzed faintly through thin walls, and children settled into beds. To outsiders, it was nothing remarkable, just another night in a forgotten town. But in Cabin 28, events were aligning for a horror that would leave the community forever scarred. The gathering inside Cabin 28. Sue Sharp was home with her 3 youngest children, Tina, Rick, and Greg. A neighborhood boy, 12-year-old Justin Smartt, who was spending the night with Rick and Greg, also joined them. The living room was cluttered but cozy, the kind of environment that spoke more to love and survival than to order and wealth. Meanwhile, John Sharp, the oldest son, and his friend Dana Wingate were out in Quincy, just a few miles away. They were seen hitchhiking along the road earlier that evening, trying to get back to Keddie after hanging out with friends. By around 10 p.m., the 2 boys finally returned to Cabin 28, where Sue and the younger kids were winding down. Sheila, the 14-year-old daughter, had decided to spend the night at a friend's house just down the road. Her decision would save her life, though she couldn't have known it at the time. As midnight approached, the cabin was full but calm. Rick, Greg, and Justin had already gone to bed in the back room. Tina had also turned in early. Sue likely sat quietly, perhaps watching TV or reading, while John and Dana lounged in the living room. The cabin, though cramped, was alive with the ordinary sounds of family, whispers of conversation, the rustling of blankets, the creak of old wood settling in the night. The invasion. At some point after midnight, everything changed. No one knows exactly how the intruders entered Cabin 28. There was no sign of forced entry, which suggests the killers either knew the family or were let in willingly. Some speculate Sue might have opened the door to someone she trusted, perhaps a neighbor. Others believe John or Dana could have let in a familiar face. What is clear is that once inside, the attackers unleashed unimaginable violence. The crime scene, later described by investigators, revealed a brutality that went beyond robbery or a quick act of rage. It was prolonged, calculated, and filled with personal anger. John, Dana, and Sue were attacked with a combination of weapons, a hammer, a knife, and possibly even a rifle used as a blunt object. The force used was excessive, indicating either a deep hatred or a need to send a message. Sue, the mother, was found in the living room, bound with medical tape and electrical cord. She had been beaten, stabbed, and left face down on the floor. John and Dana were nearby, both suffering from multiple blows to the head and stab wounds. Dana, in particular, showed signs of being manually strangled, suggesting his death may have come after a struggle. Blood spattered the walls and floor. Furniture was overturned. The violence had spread across the small living room like a storm tearing through a fragile shelter. And then there was Tina. The 12-year-old was not in the cabin when authorities arrived. At first, it was unclear if she had been taken, had run away in terror, or was among the victims hidden beneath the chaos. But as dawn broke, her absence was undeniable. Tina was missing. The children in the back room. What makes the crime even more chilling is that 3 young boys slept through the massacre just steps away. In the back bedroom, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin remained unharmed. Some believe they may have been awake and too terrified to move, while others accept the official claim that they slept through the violence. Later accounts from Justin would complicate this. Under hypnosis, he described witnessing fragments of the crime, suggesting he had seen parts of the attack or its aftermath. But the reliability of that testimony has always been debated. Still, the fact remains. 3 children were left alive, untouched, in a house drenched with horror. Why the killers spared them has been one of the lingering mysteries. Were they overlooked? Or was it intentional, a choice made to terrorize by leaving behind witnesses too young to fully understand? The discovery. The next morning, April 12, Sheila returned home from her sleepover, expecting to find her mother and siblings as usual. Instead, she stepped into a nightmare that no child should ever have to see. Opening the door to Cabin 28, she was confronted by the sight of her mother, brother, and his friend lying dead in the living room. The bodies were bound and bloodied, the room in disarray, and the silence inside was heavy and unnatural. At first, the shock must have frozen her, but instinct kicked in. She ran out for help. Neighbors rushed over, followed by authorities. What they encountered was a crime scene so violent it stunned even seasoned investigators. One sheriff's deputy later described it as one of the most disturbing scenes he had ever witnessed. The boys in the back room were found alive, frightened and confused. But Tina was gone. Her disappearance added another layer of terror. Not only had there been a massacre, but a child had been abducted. Chaos and confusion. The arrival of law enforcement should have been the first step toward justice, but instead, it marked the beginning of decades of frustration and doubt. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office quickly secured the area, but accounts later revealed serious flaws in how the scene was handled. Evidence was contaminated, leads weren't followed, and the scope of the investigation seemed limited from the start. Neighbors were interviewed, but no clear suspects emerged immediately. Some residents spoke of hearing muffled screams or thuds in the night, but no one had called police. Others mentioned seeing strangers in the area in the days before. But the truth was hard to pin down, and the panic in the community made people second-guess their own memories. For the Sharps, surviving children, life had shattered overnight. Sheila was suddenly both a victim and a witness, forced to navigate the trauma of what she had seen. Rick and Greg, though alive, had slept within earshot of horror they would never fully understand. And the absence of Tina hung like a shadow over everything. The unanswered question of where she had gone and whether she was still alive was almost worse than the murders themselves. A town in fear. News of the killing spread quickly through Quincy and beyond. For a small, rural community like Plumas County, this level of violence was almost unthinkable. Families locked their doors for the first time in years. Children weren't allowed to walk the woods alone anymore. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, wondering if the killer could be someone among them. At first, theories swirled. Was it a stranger passing through, a drifter who stumbled into the wrong cabin? Or was it something more personal, a targeted attack born out of anger or revenge? The sheriff's office tried to calm the community, but the brutality of the crime made it impossible to dismiss the idea that the killer was still close by. The residents of Keddie lived with the fear that whoever had done this was walking free, hidden in plain sight among the trees and cabins. The silence of the forest. The Sierra Nevada woods that had once seemed peaceful now felt threatening. At night, every creak of the cabin walls, every snap of a branch outside, carried new weight. The people of Keddie looked at the forest differently after April 12. It wasn't just a backdrop to their lives anymore. It was a hiding place, a vast and unforgiving wilderness that could swallow secrets whole. And within that silence was Tina, missing, unaccounted for, and at the center of a growing storm of speculation. Some clung to hope that she was alive, taken by someone who might eventually return her. Others feared the worst. But the truth about Tina, and the truth about what happened inside Cabin 28 that night, would not come quickly. For years, the answers would remain buried in shadows, tangled up in rumors, theories, and official missteps. The Keddie Cabin Murders were no longer just a local tragedy. They were a mystery, one that would baffle investigators, haunt surviving family members, and draw the attention of true crime followers for decades to come. And in those first days after the discovery, no one realized how far-reaching the consequences would be, or how many secrets were still waiting to be uncovered in that little mountain town. The crime scene and the investigation. From the moment authorities stepped into Cabin 28, the sheer brutality of the crime scene was impossible to ignore. The violence was unlike anything Plumas County deputies had ever encountered. Yet, instead of becoming a model of careful police work, the investigation quickly began to unravel. Decisions made in those first crucial hours and days would go on to haunt the case for decades. A scene of unimaginable brutality. The living room of Cabin 28 looked less like a home and more like the aftermath of a war zone. Sue Sharp lay near the sofa, face down, her hands and ankles bound with electrical cord and medical tape. Her injuries were extensive blunt force trauma to the head, multiple stab wounds, and signs of attempted strangulation. She had fought for her life, but the attackers overwhelmed her. Nearby was John, her 15-year-old son. He had suffered repeated blows to the head with such force that his skull was fractured. His friend Dana Wingate had been bludgeoned and manually strangled, with evidence suggesting he had been tied up at some point during the attack. Blood covered the floor and walls, smeared in chaotic patterns that suggested a prolonged struggle. A bent steak knife lay on the floor. Another knife and a hammer were recovered at the scene. Investigators would later theorize that at least 2 weapons had been used, and possibly more. Despite the carnage, some aspects stood out as unusual. There was no sign of forced entry, which hinted that the killers had either been invited in or were familiar enough to enter without resistance. The bindings on the victims suggested control. This wasn't a crime that erupted suddenly. It had unfolded over time. And then there was the most chilling detail. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was gone. The absence of her body made the scene feel incomplete, as though one part of the horror had been deliberately removed. Early law enforcement response. Plumas County Sheriff Doug Thomas and his deputies took control of the investigation. On paper, they began with the right steps, interviewing neighbors, securing the cabin, and collecting evidence. But in practice, critical errors piled up almost immediately. The crime scene was not adequately protected. Neighbors, volunteers, and even curious onlookers were allowed far too close. In a rural county with limited resources, the small sheriff's department simply wasn't equipped to handle a quadruple homicide of this scale. Evidence was trampled, mishandled, or never collected at all. Some reports even claimed that the sheriff's deputies failed to dust certain areas for fingerprints, ignored potential trace evidence, and failed to test some of the weapons properly. Whether from incompetence, lack of training, or something more deliberate, the mishandling left massive holes in the investigation. Theories take shape. Almost immediately, the sheriff's office faced pressure to explain what had happened. The brutality of the murders suggested personal anger, not a random break-in. But who could hate Sue Sharp and her children enough to commit such an atrocity? Neighbors pointed fingers in different directions. Some whispered about drifters and transients who often passed through the area. Others suspected people within Keddie itself. The isolated community was tight-knit but also filled with personal conflicts, secrets, and simmering resentments. Then there was the matter of Sue's personal life. She was a single mother raising 5 children, something that stood out in a small rural town in the early 80s. Some men resented her independence, while others gossiped about her relationships. It wasn't hard to imagine that jealousy or anger might have motivated someone. And yet, despite the gossip and suspicions, no arrests were made. Leads dried up almost as soon as they appeared. The mishandling of Tina's case. The most urgent issue, beyond the murders themselves, was the disappearance of Tina. In the immediate aftermath, the sheriff's office treated her case as part of the homicide investigation, but there were disagreements over whether she had been abducted or killed during the attack. For weeks, search parties scoured the woods surrounding Keddie. Volunteers, dogs, and deputies combed the rugged terrain, but no sign of Tina was found. Her disappearance became the darkest mystery within an already horrifying case. The idea that she might still be alive gave her family faint hope, but it also raised chilling questions. Why had she been taken? Was she a target all along? The lack of answers only deepened the community's sense of fear. It wasn't just that a killer was on the loose. It was that a child had vanished into the wilderness, and no one knew if she was dead or alive. Overlooked suspects. In the weeks that followed, 2 names surfaced repeatedly in connection to the murders: Martin Smartt and John Boubede. Marty was a neighbor who lived just down the road in Cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn and their children. Bo, an older man with ties to organized crime, had been living with Marty at the time. Both men had questionable reputations. Marty was known to have a violent temper and a rocky marriage. Bo was a drifter with a criminal past. The fact that they lived so close to the Sharps and that Marilyn was close friends with Sue made them stand out immediately. But while rumors circulated, law enforcement didn't seem to press the issue. Some would later claim that Marty and Bo were interviewed but dismissed quickly, despite inconsistencies in their stories. Others suggested that Sheriff Doug Thomas himself had personal ties to the suspects, creating a potential conflict of interest. Years later, documents and testimony would reveal that Marty had confessed to his therapist about being involved in the murders. That information was allegedly passed to authorities but never acted on. Whether it was negligence or deliberate cover-up, the result was the same. 2 prime suspects slipped away. The community reacts. For the people of Keddie and Quincy, the lack of progress was infuriating. How could such a gruesome crime, committed in such a small community, go unsolved. Parents began keeping their children inside after dark. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now secured with multiple locks and makeshift barricades. Some families even moved away, unwilling to live in the shadow of Cabin 28. The murders left a psychological scar on the community. The resort, once a cheap but peaceful place to live, now carried the weight of fear and suspicion. Every creak of the trees or crunch of footsteps in the night carried new menace. The case goes cold. Despite interviews, searches, and mounting pressure, the case began to stall. No arrests were made, no charges filed. By the summer of 1981, investigators had little more than rumors and fragments of evidence. The sheriff's office reassured the public that the investigation was ongoing, but privately, many admitted they had no solid leads. The mistakes made in those first days had cost them dearly, and without modern forensic tools, there was little hope of recovery. By the end of the year, the Keddie Cabin Murders had gone from an urgent investigation to a lingering cold case. For the surviving Sharp children, life would never return to normal. And for the town of Keddie, the cabin stood as a grim reminder that the killer or killers were still out there, walking free. And though the case seemed frozen, it wasn't over. Because 3 years later, a gruesome discovery in the woods would bring the nightmare back to life and add new layers of mystery to an already haunting case, theories, suspects, and silence. By the summer of 1981, the Keddie Cabin Murders had already shifted from an active investigation to an unsolved mystery. 3 people were dead, 1 child was missing, and the Plumas County Sheriff's Office had no answers. For Sue's surviving children, and for the tight-knit community around Keddie, the silence from law enforcement became as chilling as the murders themselves. It seemed almost impossible that such violence could occur in such a small, isolated place without someone knowing something. As rumors spread, 2 names rose to the surface again and again: Martin Smartt and John Boubede. Martin Smartt. Marty lived just a few cabins away from the Sharps. He was a U.S. Army veteran who had moved to Keddie with his wife Marilyn and their children. To outsiders, he might have looked like just another struggling family man. But to those who knew him, Marty had a darker side. He was described as hot-tempered, controlling, and abusive toward Marilyn. Sue Sharp and Marilyn had become close friends, bonding over their shared struggles as mothers. Marilyn confided in Sue about her rocky marriage, and Sue, who had endured her own history of domestic abuse, encouraged her to leave Marty. That detail would later feel important had Sue's advice made her a target of Marty's rage. On the night of April 11, 1981, Marty and Bo were reportedly at a local bar. Marilyn later told investigators that Marty had returned home that night and burned some clothes in the fireplace. A strange act that raised suspicions but was never fully investigated. Years later, even more disturbing details would emerge. Marty allegedly confessed to his therapist that he had been involved in the murders. According to records, the therapist passed that confession to law enforcement, but nothing came of it. Whether through negligence, disbelief, or corruption, the lead was dropped and Marty was never arrested. Marty eventually left Keddie, moved to Oregon, and died in 2000. He never faced charges. John Boubede. Bo was an older man, a drifter with alleged ties to organized crime in Chicago. At the time of the murders, he had been staying with Marty in Cabin 26. Some described him as intimidating, a man with a shady past who didn't quite fit in among the struggling families of Keddie. Investigators briefly looked at Bo, but like Marty, he was dismissed early on. He moved away not long after the murders and also died years later, never answering questions about his possible role in the crime. To many amateur investigators and locals, the pairing of Marty and Bo made too much sense to ignore. They lived close by. They had questionable alibis. They had possible motives. And they had personalities capable of violence. The fact that they walked away untouched only fueled suspicion that the sheriff's department was either incompetent or actively covering something up. The missing girl. While suspicions swirled around Marty and Bo, the mystery of Tina's disappearance lingered like a wound that would not heal. Search parties scoured the dense forests, the creeks, and the old railroad tracks. Flyers were posted, neighbors questioned again, but no trace of Tina appeared. For Sue's surviving children, the uncertainty was unbearable. They had lost their mother and brother, and now their sister was missing. The question of whether she was alive tormented them for years. Then in 1984, the mystery took a grim turn. A man collecting cans in Butte County, about 100 miles from Keddie, stumbled across a fragment of a human skull and part of a mandible. Nearby were remnants of clothing and other small items. The remains were sent for analysis, and it was confirmed. They belonged to Tina Sharp. 3 years after the murders, Tina's fate was finally known, though the details of her death remained hidden. How had she been taken from Cabin 28? Was she alive for hours, days, or weeks afterward? Who had brought her so far into the wilderness? The discovery answered one question but raised 100 more. The revelation also deepened suspicions about the original investigation. Why had the sheriff's office failed to protect Tina? Could she have been rescued if authorities had acted differently in those first hours after the crime? Motives and theories. Over time, a number of theories emerged to explain the brutality of the Keddie murders. Domestic jealousy. The theory that Marty killed Sue because she encouraged Marilyn to leave him is one of the most enduring. In this scenario, Marty saw Sue as a threat to his control, and possibly fueled by alcohol and rage, decided to eliminate her. Dana and John may have simply been collateral damage witnesses who got in the way. Drug connection. Some speculated that the murders were connected to drugs. Keddie, though small, was not immune to the drug trade of the early 1980s. Dana had been in trouble with the law before, and rumors circulated about marijuana and harder substances moving through the area. Was the attack a deal gone wrong, or a warning? Random violence. Others believed the killers were drifters or strangers, people passing through the area who stumbled on Cabin 28. But this theory never fully fit. The bindings, the prolonged nature of the attack, and the abduction of Tina suggested planning and familiarity. Law enforcement cover-up. A darker theory suggests that the sheriff's office intentionally ignored evidence pointing to Marty and Bo. Some claim that Bo was an informant for federal law enforcement or had connections that made him untouchable. Others accused Sheriff Doug Thomas of being personally close to Marty, leading to a conflict of interest. While these claims have never been proven, the mishandling of the case fueled suspicions of corruption. The silence of survivors. For Sheila, Rick, and Greg, life after the murders was shaped by silence. Sheila, who had discovered the bodies, carried trauma that would never fade. The younger boys, who had slept in the back room, struggled with the idea that they had been so close to death. Justin Smartt, the neighbor boy who had been sleeping over, later gave statements under hypnosis suggesting he had witnessed part of the crime. He claimed he saw 2 men, one with long hair, one with short, in the house, and described them attacking Sue and the others. Many believe he was describing Marty and Bo, though law enforcement downplayed the significance of his testimony. For years, the survivors lived in the shadow of unanswered questions. Why had they been spared? Why had Tina been taken? And why had law enforcement failed them? The case fades, the fear remains. By the late 1980s, the Keddie murders had faded from headlines, but the fear lingered. Cabin 28 became a dark landmark, its windows shattered, its walls marked with graffiti. People whispered about it, dared each other to go inside, but no one could stay long. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, as though the violence still lived in the walls. For true crime enthusiasts, the case became a point of obsession, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. For the families of the victims, it remained a wound that would not close. The murders were brutal enough to shock the nation, but it was the silence, the lack of arrests, the lack of justice, that made the Keddie Cabin Murders stand out as one of California's most haunting cold cases. And though the 1980s faded into the 1990s, the unanswered questions stayed alive. Why had evidence been ignored? Why had suspects been dismissed? And what secrets still lingered in those mountain woods? The case might have seemed frozen in time, but years later, whispers of new evidence and modern forensic techniques would breathe life back into the mystery and suggest that the truth had been closer all along, a cold case and a haunted cabin. By the 1990s, the Keddie Cabin Murders had become more of a chilling local legend than an active criminal investigation. The official files gathered dust in the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. For the families of Sue, John, Dana, and Tina, justice felt like a dream slipping further away with each passing year. The murders weren't just unsolved. They were largely forgotten, except by the people whose lives had been shattered inside Cabin 28. Cabin 28 turns into a landmark of fear. After the murders, Cabin 28 stood for years, scarred and abandoned. What had once been a simple family getaway now drew thrill-seekers, ghost hunters, and teenagers daring each other to step inside. Broken windows and graffiti covered its walls, while inside, remnants of its violent past remained. The community knew what had happened there, and word spread beyond Plumas County. Travelers heard the whispers, "That's the cabin where they were murdered." For many, it became a pilgrimage site, a place to experience horror in real life. But for survivors like Sheila Sharp, the sight of Cabin 28 was not a thrill. It was trauma frozen in wood and nails. She had walked into that cabin on April 12, 1981, and her life had never been the same. Every board in that house was a reminder of her mother, her brother, her friend, and the little sister who had vanished only to be found dead years later. A case that wouldn't let go. Though official attention waned, amateur investigators kept the story alive. In the pre-internet days, rumors traveled by word of mouth, local newspapers, and whispers in diners. Some swore that everyone in Keddie knew Marty and Bo were guilty but couldn't prove it. Others speculated that the murders were tied to drugs, corruption, or even darker secrets. As the years passed, new technology changed everything. The internet gave rise to true crime forums where strangers across the country obsessed over cold cases. And soon, the Keddie murders found their way into those online spaces. Web sleuths and other message boards became digital campfires, where theories about Cabin 28 burned brightly. Posters dissected every known fact, the bindings, the weapons, the missing hammer, Tina's remains. They shared rumors that hadn't been printed in newspapers. They debated whether Justin's hypnosis testimony was credible, or whether law enforcement had buried confessions. For the Sharp family survivors, seeing strangers pick apart their trauma online was complicated. On one hand, it kept the case alive. On the other, it turned their real pain into fuel for strangers' speculation. The weight of survival. The surviving Sharp children grew into adulthood carrying scars that couldn't be seen. Sheila, who had discovered the bodies, spent years trying to find stability, haunted by the sight of her mother and brother. Rick and Greg, who had been asleep in the back room while chaos unfolded, struggled with guilt and confusion. Survivors often wonder, why me? And the Sharp children were no exception. Justin Smartt, the neighbor boy who had been there that night, faced his own lifelong trauma. He had allegedly seen part of the attack, but law enforcement never treated his testimony with the seriousness it deserved. For decades, people debated whether Justin's statements had been accurate, influenced by hypnosis, or suppressed because they implicated Marty. These children, now adults, carried the truth of April 1981 in silence, often unable to speak about it even to those closest to them. Survivors of violent crime often describe living with the second wound, not the crime itself, but the way the justice system fails them afterward. In Keddie, that wound stayed open for decades. The ghost town years. Keddie itself changed as the years rolled on. Once a small but lively resort community, it fell into decline after the murders. Businesses shuttered, cabins decayed, and by the 2000s, Keddie was less a town and more a ghost of what it had been. The train tracks still cut through the mountains, the forest still loomed with its cold beauty, but the community spirit was gone. The murders weren't the only reason Keddie died, but they were a heavy shadow. Who wanted to vacation in a place forever tied to such brutality? For locals, there was no way to separate the cabins from the crime. Keddie became a place people spoke about with shivers, not fond memories. Cabin 28 itself deteriorated further. Vandals broke in. Urban explorers filmed shaky camcorder footage inside its rotting frame. Paranormal investigators declared it haunted. And through it all, the real story, 4 lives brutally taken, a family destroyed, suspects ignored, was reduced to folklore. Finally, in 2004, Cabin 28 was demolished. To some, it was an erasure of history. To others, it was the only way to silence the ghost of that terrible night. The boards were torn down, but the legend remained. Even without the building, people remembered. The rise of true crime media. The late 1990s and early 2000s also brought a cultural shift. True crime exploded into mainstream media. Television shows like Unsolved Mysteries and Cold Case Files introduced millions of viewers to haunting cases. The internet allowed independent researchers to dig into old files, and soon podcasts and documentaries gave new life to forgotten murders. The Keddie Cabin Murders fit perfectly into this wave. They had everything: a small town, an unsolved massacre, ignored suspects, and a missing child. When Cabin 28 was featured in books, online articles, and eventually documentaries, interest surged again. Viewers who had never set foot in California's Sierra Nevada mountains suddenly knew about Keddie. They debated theories in YouTube comments. They shared timelines on Reddit. The story spread far beyond the borders of Plumas County. Lost evidence inflating hope. For the families, the attention was bittersweet. Every headline reminded them of their loss. Every theory forced them to relive the details. And worst of all, despite the renewed interest, no one had been held accountable. Rumors circulated that evidence had been lost, or worse, destroyed, by the sheriff's office. Some said entire case files had gone missing. Others whispered that powerful people had made sure Marty and Bo were protected. What was fact and what was speculation? By the 2000s, even locals struggled to separate the two. But one thing was certain: no arrests had ever been made and justice had never come. For the surviving Sharp children, it felt like being trapped in time. They had grown older, but the case had not moved forward. Each year was another reminder that their mother, brothers, and sister had been taken, and that the world had not cared enough to bring closure. The internet keeps the case alive. If law enforcement wasn't going to solve the case, the internet seemed determined to try. By the mid-2000s, dedicated websites were collecting everything known about the murders: old newspaper clippings, autopsy reports, leaked police notes. True crime enthusiasts pored over them, creating elaborate timelines and suspect profiles. Some online sleuths claimed to have uncovered new details. Others repeated long-circulating rumors. At times, the theories veered into wild territory, accusing local officials, neighbors, or even surviving children. The anonymity of the internet meant anyone could claim to know the truth, and separating fact from fiction was nearly impossible. But buried in the noise were important questions. Why had Marty's alleged confession been ignored? Why had Bo's background been dismissed? And why had Tina's disappearance not been treated as an urgent kidnapping from the start? Even without answers, one thing became clear: the Keddie Cabin Murders would not be forgotten. The internet had ensured the story would live on, shared, debated, and investigated by people who weren't even alive when it happened. The silence before the storm. By the early 2000s, more than 2 decades had passed. The Sharp children were middle-aged. Keddie was almost deserted. Cabin 28 was rubble. The case was cold, colder than almost any other, with witnesses dead, suspects gone, and evidence decayed. And yet, there was a sense among some that the story wasn't finished. Forensic technology was advancing. DNA analysis was becoming sharper, more precise. And somewhere in the evidence lockers of Plumas County, there were items that had never been tested. The question wasn't just who had killed Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. The deeper question was, why had no one been willing to bring their killers to justice? That silence, heavier than the crime itself, hung over Keddie like a cloud. But just when it seemed the case would die with those who remembered it, new investigators would arrive, determined to pick through the ashes and bring to light what had been hidden for decades. New leads, old secrets. For more than 3 decades, the Keddie Cabin Murders lingered like an unfinished sentence. The families carried grief that never healed. The community carried whispers and suspicions that refused to fade, and law enforcement carried a reputation for failure. But the 2010s brought a shift. Cold cases across the country were being reopened thanks to DNA advances, digital databases, and new leadership unafraid to dig where their predecessors had refused. In Plumas County, that meant a new sheriff who wasn't willing to let Cabin 28 remain a stain on the department's history. A sheriff with questions. In 2013, Sheriff Greg Hagwood announced that the Keddie murders were being actively investigated again. Hagwood, who had grown up in the area, had never been satisfied with how the case was handled. He believed mistakes had been made and that justice had been denied. Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg began combing through what remained of the files. They were stunned to discover that key evidence had been ignored, overlooked, or worse, hidden away for decades. Boxes of case materials had sat untouched, gathering dust. Within them were items that, in the 1980s, couldn't be analyzed, but now could. The missing hammer and other clues. Among the discoveries was a hammer recovered years after the murders near a pond in Keddie. It matched the description of one missing from Martin Smartt's tools at the time of the killings. Was it one of the weapons used that night? Forensic testing suggested it could be. There were also fragments of tape and other items that still contained potential DNA. While degradation over time limited results, the investigators believed they were closer to finding answers than ever before. Even more damning was what they found in the written records. Tucked into old files was a recording from 1981, a taped conversation between Martin Smartt and his therapist. On it, Marty essentially confessed. He admitted to killing Sue and Tina, though his exact words were clouded with bitterness and paranoia. The therapist had reportedly alerted law enforcement decades earlier, but nothing had been done. To Hagwood and Gamberg, the conclusion was clear. The original investigation had been compromised, whether through incompetence, negligence, or deliberate cover-up. Theories of a cover-up. The idea of a cover-up had circulated for years. Some believed Sheriff Doug Thomas, who led the case in 1981, had been close to Marty and shielded him from suspicion. Others suggested that Boubede, with alleged ties to organized crime and possibly law enforcement agencies, had protection that extended beyond Plumas County. Was it corruption? Was it fear? Or simply the arrogance of small-town officials who didn't want to admit mistakes? Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. A confession had been buried, evidence ignored, and a family left without justice. The survivors speak. As the case reopened, survivors of Cabin 28 spoke more openly. Sheila Sharp, who had carried her trauma in silence for years, began working with investigators and journalists to tell her story. For Sheila, it wasn't just about solving a crime, It was about ensuring her mother and siblings weren't forgotten. Rick and Greg, who had been so young when it happened, carried memories too painful to fully share. Their survival was both a blessing and a burden. They had lived, but with scars no one could see. Justin Smartt, Marty's stepson who had been in the house that night, remained a complicated figure. Some believed he knew more than he ever said, whether consciously or buried in memory. Others saw him as another victim of Marty's violence, forced into silence by fear of his stepfather. For all of them, the reopening of the case felt like a chance to breathe again. Maybe, finally, the truth would come out. Media brings the case back to life. Around the same time, documentaries and podcasts reignited public interest. Court TV, People magazine investigates, and independent filmmakers revisited the case, combining archival footage with new interviews. The internet buzzed with updates whenever investigators announced a breakthrough. Viewers were horrified to learn how much evidence had been ignored in the 1980s. They were captivated by the mystery of Tina's abduction, and they were outraged that clear suspects like Marty and Bo had never been charged. For the first time in decades, national attention was on Keddie again. But this time, it wasn't just morbid fascination. There was pressure on law enforcement to deliver answers. The case against Marty and Bo. By 2016, Hagwood and Gamberg were confident in their conclusion. Martin Smartt and Boubede were the killers. They believed the motive was personal, Marty's anger at Sue Sharp for encouraging Marilyn to leave him. Bo, perhaps fueled by loyalty or his own violent impulses, had helped. The brutality of the murders, they argued, was the product of Marty's rage. Tina's abduction was likely an effort to silence the only child who had witnessed too much. But both men were long dead. Bo had died in 1988, Marty in 2000. No trial would ever be possible. No handcuffs would ever click shut around their wrists. For some, that was a devastating truth, to know the killers had walked free for years. For others, it was enough to have confirmation. After decades of silence, someone was finally saying out loud what so many had suspected all along. Justice without closure. The Sharp family survivors received the news with mixed emotions. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible, but acknowledgement mattered. To hear law enforcement say, finally, "We know who did this," was a small measure of peace. Yet the scars remained. No investigation could erase the trauma of Sheila's discovery, the terror of the boys in the back room, the years of silence and neglect. The Keddie murders would always be part of them. A case that echoes. Even today, the Keddie Cabin Murders remain one of California's most haunting true crime stories. The details, the bindings, the missing hammer, the abducted child, read like a horror script. The failures of law enforcement read like a cautionary tale. The case has become a symbol of how justice can be delayed, denied, or destroyed. It has also become a reminder that truth has a way of resurfacing, even after decades of silence. Keddie itself is nearly gone now, its cabins rotted or demolished, its once busy resort forgotten. The forest has reclaimed much of the land, and travelers pass through without knowing the darkness that once lived there. But for those who remember, the ghosts of Cabin 28 never left. What remains unanswered? Even with the case unofficially solved, questions remain. Was law enforcement protecting Marty and Bo, or simply incompetent? Did others know and help cover it up? What exactly happened to Tina in the hours between her abduction and her death? And how many opportunities for justice were lost in those first crucial weeks of 1981? For some, the Keddie murders will never truly be solved until those questions are answered. The legacy of Cabin 28. Today, the story lives on in documentaries, podcasts, and countless online discussions. True crime fans debate details late into the night. Locals still lower their voices when the murders come up, and the Sharp family names remain tied forever to a cabin in the woods. The legacy of Cabin 28 is not just one of horror, but of resilience. The Sharp children survived unimaginable loss. Investigators decades later refused to let the case stay buried, and strangers across the world, connected only by the internet, have carried the memory forward. The Keddie murders remind us that time does not erase truth. It only waits for someone brave enough to uncover it. And though Cabin 28 no longer stands, its story still echoes through the trees of the Sierra Nevada, a chilling reminder that secrets can linger, but so can the fight for justice, the legacy of the Keddie Cabin murders. When Cabin 28 was torn down in 2004, many locals believed its destruction would close a chapter of horror. The decaying structure had loomed as a grim reminder of a night no one wanted to remember yet could never forget. But even in rubble, the story of the Keddie murders lived on. For survivors, investigators, and the wider world of true crime, the murders became more than a case file. They became a haunting symbol of trauma, unanswered questions, and the dark ways violence can ripple through time. A family scarred forever. The Sharp children carried their losses into adulthood. Sheila, who discovered the bodies, spoke candidly in later interviews about the lifelong burden of being a survivor. She described recurring nightmares, the struggle to live a normal life, and the feeling that justice had been stolen from her family. Rick and Greg, only 10 and 5 years old at the time, had been sleeping just a few feet away while their family was slaughtered. Though they weren't physically harmed, the psychological scars ran deep. Survivors of childhood trauma often describe carrying invisible wounds, and the Sharp boys were no exception. For all of them, the lack of justice amplified the pain. They weren't only survivors of murder, they were survivors of silence. Knowing the killers were never prosecuted, watching as evidence went ignored, left them feeling abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. Martin Smartt and Justin. Another layer of tragedy belonged to Martin Smartt and her son Justin. Marilyn had left Marty not long after the murders, but her connection to him and her friendship with Sue tied her forever to the case. For years, she lived with the suspicion that her ex-husband and his friend Bo were responsible. Justin, meanwhile, carried the trauma of being in the house that night. His hypnosis-induced testimony described 2 men attacking Sue and the boys, but law enforcement dismissed it as unreliable. Some believe Justin saw more than anyone realized and was silenced, whether by fear of his stepfather Marty or by investigators unwilling to pursue the truth. Justin grew into adulthood under the shadow of that night. To this day, his role remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Was he a confused child witness whose memory blurred under hypnosis? Or was he a silenced key to unlocking the full truth? Keddie, from resort to ghost town. The murders didn't just scar individuals, they scarred a place. Keddie had once been a cozy resort town, a getaway tucked in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Families came to hike, fish, and enjoy cabin life. But after 1981, Keddie was marked. The unsolved crime cast a shadow that no tourism campaign could erase. Businesses closed, cabins emptied. By the 1990s, Keddie was more ghost town than resort. Even locals avoided the area, speaking of it in hushed tones. Cabin 28, standing in rot and graffiti, became a magnet for urban explorers and thrill seekers. To some, it was haunted. To others, it was cursed. When it was finally demolished, the physical reminder was gone, but the legend only grew. Online communities began circulating photos and grainy videos of the cabin's interior, fueling speculation about what had happened inside its walls. Keddie became part of California's dark folklore, etched into the landscape as a place where evil had walked freely. Alternative theories. Though Sheriff Hagwood and investigator Gamberg concluded that Marty and Bo were responsible, not everyone agrees. Theories still circulate. fueled by decades of speculation and missing evidence. The drug connection. Some argue that the murders were tied to drug activity in Plumas County. Dana, though only a teen, had minor run-ins with the law. Rumors circulated that local dealers used Keddie as a hub. Was Cabin 28 a target because of something Dana or John had stumbled into? Critics of this theory argue that the overkill brutality suggests personal rage, not a business-style hit. Multiple killers. The sheer chaos, 3 people restrained and slaughtered, another abducted, suggests more than one perpetrator. Even if Marty and Bo were involved, some believe others helped. Could local law enforcement have had silent knowledge? Did neighbors know more than they admitted? Cover-up. One of the darkest theories holds that law enforcement deliberately buried evidence. Sheriff Doug Thomas, who led the original investigation, had allegedly been socially close to Marty. Was that enough to taint the case? Others argue Bo's alleged organized crime connections made him untouchable. The truth may never be known, but the missing evidence and ignored confessions fuel this suspicion endlessly. The stranger theory. A smaller camp believes the murders could have been the work of transient strangers. Keddie, with its open cabins and passing train line, attracted drifters. Perhaps the killers weren't Marty and Bo at all, but outsiders who vanished after the crime. However, the targeted violence and Tina's abduction make this theory less convincing to most. Media and pop culture. The Keddie murders have inspired countless retellings. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube deep dives have dissected every known detail. Court TV, People Magazine Investigates, and Oxygen all devoted episodes to Cabin 28. Beyond documentaries, the murders are rumored to have inspired aspects of the 2008 horror film The Strangers. Though filmmakers deny a direct link, fans note eerie similarities: a rural cabin, masked intruders, unexplained brutality. Whether coincidence or subconscious inspiration, the shadow of Keddie looms over fictional horror as well as true crime. Podcasts and online sleuth forums have kept the case alive for a new generation. On Reddit, web sleuths, and countless Facebook groups, strangers debate the timeline, suspects, and evidence. For many, the case is an obsession, a puzzle with pieces deliberately hidden. Trauma in the Internet age. The Internet gave the case global reach, but for survivors it also created new pain. Imagine logging on and seeing strangers argue about your murdered family, some sympathetic, others cruel, some even accusing survivors of involvement. For Sheila and others, the Internet is both a blessing and a curse. It keeps the story alive, but it also reopens wounds daily. This is the reality of modern true crime. Survivors, tragedies become content. Some appreciate the attention because it pressures authorities. Others resent the way strangers consume their pain like entertainment. The Keddie case embodies this tension perfectly. A symbol of cold case failure. Above all, the Keddie murders symbolize how fragile justice can be. Incompetence, negligence, or corruption, whatever the cause, meant the killers were never prosecuted. Evidence was mishandled, leads ignored, and confessions overlooked. The case now serves as a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles. Cold case investigators often cite Keddie as an example of how crucial early evidence collection and unbiased investigation are. For survivors, though, that lesson comes far too late. The enduring questions. Even with Marty and Bo named posthumously as prime suspects, questions linger. What exactly happened in those violent hours inside Cabin 28? Why was Tina abducted and taken 100 miles away? Who else, if anyone, was involved? And most haunting, could justice have been served if law enforcement had acted differently from the start? These questions keep the case alive, ensuring it will never truly fade into obscurity. The long shadow. Today, the site of Cabin 28 is quiet. The forest hums, the train whistles in the distance, but the ground remembers. Locals avoid the area, saying the air feels heavy there. For the Sharp family, every anniversary is a reminder of what was lost, not only loved ones, but the sense of safety that a home should provide. For investigators like Hagwood and Gamberg, the case remains a scar on their county's history, proof that silence and neglect can be as cruel as violence itself. And for the wider world, the Keddie murders remain a haunting puzzle, a story passed through forums, documentaries, and whispered campfire tales. Proof that evil can reach even the most ordinary places, and that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what we don't know, but what was known and ignored. The cabin may be gone, but the murders live on in memory, myth, and media. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Cabin 28, a crime that refuses to die, a story that demands to be told, and a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied.